Hey, stay right there! Don't move! What the? Hey, Tommy, eyes open, some kind of animal around.
What the hell? What happened here?
Barnes! Get Sheriff! I found the survivor! Sir, hang on. We'll take you down from there. Tommy, get the first aid!
I could hear the sound of moist soil being crushed beneath my wheels as I drove on. Water drops were sliding sideways on the windows. I was within a damp cloud, and as I accelerated, the moisture clung to the windows and the hood. A huge and bright full moon was illuminating my path through the damp air. I was getting closer to settlements. Sporadic houses were beginning to appear in the vast fields and farmlands. The fields were mostly covered with tall corn stalks. I could only spot the houses through the roofs that I could barely see behind these tall stalks. Sometimes, dim lights from an early-to-rise farmer's house caught my eye. Progressing on this road through the silence of the night sent shivers down my spine. I felt like at any moment something would appear in the back seat and take away the only safe space I had. My eyes constantly shifted to the rearview mirror. I was on high alert for any potential attack from the back seat. What a foolish thought. Little did I realize that by constantly checking the rearview mirror, I failed to notice the real danger ahead. It was too late when I saw a long shadow in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes with all my might. Whatever it was, I didn't want to harm it unintentionally. My car slid smoothly on the damp soil and tumbled to the side of the road. I found myself in the midst of a cornfield. My car had turned upside down, and the screeching noises from the engine filled the silent air. I didn't know what to do. I unbuckled my seatbelt and fell onto the car's roof. I carefully climbed out through the shattered glass. Miraculously, I hadn't sustained any injuries. I stood up with the support of the wet soil I had been crawling on. I was shaken and couldn't think straight. What had just happened? What was that shadow? Had my car really flipped? What should I do now? I was lucky to be unharmed. I knew that the only thing I could do was to seek help. I was trembling from shock. I took out my phone. Of course, there was no signal. I must have been in some remote area where signals couldn't reach. I panicked and waved my phone around, trying to catch a signal, but there was none. I was alone in the middle of the night, and I couldn't do anything. My legs gave way and I fell to the ground. I put my head in my hands and tried to calm down. Suddenly, I remembered the roofs that I could barely see behind the stalks. I had seen some houses, and perhaps some of them were empty. But I had also seen lights in a few houses. How far had I drifted from them? And which direction could I take to reach those houses? Was the moon still in front of me during my journey? Those cursed tall corn stalks. I had no idea what was around me. I could hardly make out the full moon. Damn these tall corn stalks. I decided to take to the road. Yes, if I walked, I could cover the distance until I spotted a house. But there was no road. The dirt road had disappeared. It was as if tall corn stalks had suddenly sprung up everywhere and devoured everything. No, this couldn't be happening. Even the car's crash trail was pulling me into more corn stalks. Panicking, I ran back and forth through the corn stalks, searching for a path. They were everywhere. I couldn't see any clues. What was I going to do? I decided to walk with the full moon behind me. I wanted to get out of this desolate and terrifying night as soon as possible. I walked for about an hour, trying to shake off the shock. The cornfield seemed endless, but my patience had long run out. After walking a bit further, I came across a scarecrow tied to a thick post. It didn't look normal. This thing I saw had no limbs. Its parts lay on the ground. The scarecrow was torn apart. Only its body and head remained, while small pieces had been ripped off and thrown to the ground. In the blowing wind, the remaining pieces on its body swayed, making my night even more terrifying and eerie. Were the things I was experiencing and seeing real? My head was spinning. It wasn't just the few scraps of cloth swaying in the wind that sent shivers down my spine. The stories I had heard since childhood, the tales with the same protagonist. An abnormal creature with abnormally long arms and fingers, a gaunt, tall figure. Some even called them claws instead of fingers. The stories concocted by the local folks to scare children had now captured a 30-year-old man in the dark and desolate night, right after a gruesome accident. The Scarecrow resembled his victims, unfortunate individuals with their limbs torn off, leaving only their bodies. After a brief return to the boogeyman tales of my childhood, it occurred to me that my current situation was equally unfortunate. I tried to collect my thoughts. I needed to keep going. I didn't want to stop until I found help. I resumed my journey, again with the full moon at my back. The cornstalks had thickened and seemed to have grown taller. I was struggling to pass through them. Without the moon, I wouldn't have been able to take a single step in this cornfield by now. I walked and walked and walked. I walked until I came across another scarecrow. Its condition was the same. Its limbs had been torn apart, leaving only its body. Why? How? What was tormenting these scarecrows? Naughty children who disliked scarecrows? Or was it her? I had trouble remembering her name, but I think they called her Tall Jane. In the desolation of the night, in this terrifying landscape, especially after seeing these scarecrows, I didn't want to think about Jane. I tried to shake off my thoughts. It was as if the scarecrows were narrating stories to me again. All those childhood fears were slowly coming back. It felt like I was a child again, and the scarecrows were doing their job, scaring me. When I started walking again, the only thing on my mind was Tall Jane. I walked until I found a small patch of open ground between the adjacent tall cornstalks. I stopped against the corn-walled space. In the middle of the small empty plot stood a long pole that resembled the poles from which the other scarecrows hung. I looked at it. On it, wrapped in fluttering fabrics, was another scarecrow. Yet again. As I got closer, I saw the pieces on the ground. These weren't straw or dry branches. The moonlight was gleaming off the pieces on the ground. They were wet, and they stank. The stench hit my nose when the wind carried the odors. Rotten, corpses, all the foul smells. As I approached, the smells became more repulsive. As I got closer to the pieces on the ground, the light reflecting from them turned even redder. When I reached the pole in the midst of the pieces on the ground, my heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. I could discern fingers among the pieces on the ground. I was breathless. Human fingers. They were just lying on the ground, decaying in the middle of a pool of gathered blood. I looked up. I stared at the top of the pole. I knew what I would see, but I was silently praying for it not to be what I thought. My body had suddenly grown even colder than the night. A body and a head. Only these remained. They had been hung on the pole and left to rot. In an instant, the stories in my head had turned into real images. I was petrified. Sounds started coming from among the cornstalks. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when the rustling of the corn leaves ceased, someone began to laugh. The wind couldn't laugh. My reflexes had kicked in from fear. I ran, faster than I had ever run, in the exact opposite direction of where the sound was coming from. I wanted to scream out of fear, but I couldn't waste my breath. I also didn't think there was anyone around to help. I didn't know where I was headed, and the pain I felt as I bumped into the cornstalks didn't matter. I was running, but she was coming after me. I was sure of it. Only Jane, who left just the body behind. Tall Jane. No, it couldn't be. This must be a madman. A murderer who had grown up with the same stories, a psychopath. Now he was after me, and I had walked right into his arms. Was he performing a ritual, or waiting for me? I didn't know. I needed to run, without stopping. When I reached another clearing, she stood in the center looking at me. My breath was taken away and my throat closed. A shadow much taller than an ordinary person standing beneath the moonlight. She was looking at me. Her body was gaunt. Her arms and hands were abnormally long. They didn't even look like hands. They resembled sharp claws, extending from the ends of his arms. Long, dirty hair covered her face. She had no clothing on. She was gaunt and terrifying. She was waiting for me. She was standing in front of a newly erected post, looking at me. Was this truly her? The stories had come to life, and all those "I saw her" tales and accounts were real. Jane was real. And the next victim was me. All the absurd tales that I thought had been fabricated to scare children were now jumped at me with a single scream. I couldn't move. Even if I couldn't escape. Jane was not a human being. She was a monstrosity. I felt the sharp claws piercing through my abdomen. I couldn't make a sound. She lifted me up. I saw his yellow eyes looking at me through the strands of hair. She carried me to the post like a scarecrow and threaded a large hook through the end. My body was rigid. Even the shock of the hook piercing my lungs didn't register as pain. None of my body parts, except for my eyes, were responsive. As the horror that had paralyzed my body subsided, I realized that my left leg was missing. Jane had torn it apart, scattered it on the ground, and was now pulling a large piece from within her repulsive mouth, hidden amidst her hair. The pain had just reached my brain. It was overwhelming. I began to scream in pain and agony. What I had seen and felt was overwhelming. I needed to break free from this hook. I needed to escape. I didn't care how. I could even run on my hands. I felt my head spinning and my vision darkening. I had lost too much blood. I remember hearing a gunshot just before losing consciousness.